Uh, Edward Langille has been professor of French language and literature at St. Francis Xavier University since 1989 and was recently appointed Jules Leger Chair in the Humanities and Social Sciences. He specializes in Enlightenment studies and is the North American correspondent for the Société des Études Voltairiennes, and he is currently working on a book entitled Voltaire's Workshop, which examines the elusive sources of Candide. The title of his talk is Two Solitudes, which we recognize here, or Entente Cordiale. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start by saying that I was extremely pleased to be asked to come here today. I knew Patrick Lee and was indebted to him as a mentor, and I was absolutely thrilled to learn that McGill University had acquired his splendid collection of works. It's a great treasure for not only the city of Montreal, but the entire country. So my congratulations to McGill University for that. I entitled this talk Entente Cordiale, or Two Solitudes, in recognition of the two great traditions of scholarship engendered by Voltaire's Candide, the French and the Anglo-American. Initially, I was concerned to show how these two approaches diverged. Upon reflection, I've concluded that although English speakers read Candide differently from their French counterparts, there is general agreement on at least one point. Any genuine reading of Candide must take into account not only the great writer's life, but his immense literary culture as well. The French, starting with Lanson and Maurice, have been inclined to treat Candide as a work of elegant and witty concision, and the highest expression of Voltairian irony. Their approach emphasizes literary history in its strictest sense, formal stylistic considerations, and Voltaire's biography, consistently seeing the work as an allegory of its author's life and mood. And I would like to point out here that the word pessimism was actually coined by a Jesuit critic in response to the title Candide ou l'optimisme. The Anglo-American tradition differs somewhat from this in its attempt to engage with the work's ideas. For example, Voltaire's apparent parody of Leibnizian optimism, or the meaning of the tale's famous conclusion. To this we might add the appeal to North American readers and critics of Candide's assault on aristocratic privilege, or its utopianism as expressed in the El Dorado chapters. In the English-speaking world, Candide remains an accessible masterpiece. This is perhaps not entirely surprising. André Mauroy observed that of all the classic French texts, Candide is the most closely akin to the English humorists. The best known, most singular expression of Voltaire's thought, Candide is a recognized monument of the French Enlightenment and an incomparable literary masterpiece, not only when viewed alongside its author's formidable output, which in many ways it dwarfs, but even when considered within the 1,000-year tradition of French literature. With the possible exception of Saint-Exupéry's Le Petit Prince, no other text in the French canon is as well known outside France or even in France. In addition to popular acclaim, Candide's iconic status has been consecrated by the accumulated work of generations of scholars and critics concerned with its deeper meaning, the circumstances of its composition, and the sources of its inspiration. Its every word has been the object of comment and analysis, yet, like any genuine masterpiece, Candide continues to both guard and yield its secrets. Candide is an old man's tale about life, love, and the fear of death. It is widely agreed that the novel was Voltaire's response to the problem of evil, symbolized by the Lisbon earthquake of November 1755 and the 7 Years' War. Critics have written that these events inspired the work, and in support of this interpretation, they point to the novel's historical backdrop, which portrays not only actual events, but living individuals as well. Allegedly a satire of Leibniz's philosophy of optimism, Candide implicitly challenges Voltaire's own optimism as expressed in his Lettres philosophiques and his Discours sur l'homme and in his early novels such as Zadig. Reduced to its barest outline, Candide tells the story of a well-meaning young man of honest mind and simplicity of heart, educated to see life in a positive light, and yet who finds himself brutally cast into the world of knaves, violence, disease, and corruption. All, it happens, because he innocently falls in love with a well-born young woman. Less allegorical than Swift's Gulliver's Travels, to which it's often compared, the language and structure of Candide present a double-barreled subject. Candide's assault on optimism advances in tandem with the sudden, shattering discovery of love, the pursuit of love, and eerily anticipating Proust, love's ruin. From the first page onward, Candide parodies the larmoyant tone of the sentimental romance made popular from the 1740s onward. We read Candide today as if it were a morality tale with social and philosophical overtones, but at the time it was published, it was considered a dangerous satire on religion, aristocratic privilege, and the mystique of kingship. Voltaire's caricatures of public figures were calculated to give offense, and as if this were not enough, the Duchesse de la Vallière, his close friend and confidant, deplored the novel's obscenity. A writer of Voltaire's fame, she wrote, need not stoop so low to find readers. Candide provoked grave objections throughout Europe. In Geneva, it was condemned in the strongest possible language. The Company of Pastors wrote on the 23rd of February, 1759, that the novel contained filth, inspiring inhumanity, contrary to common decency and injurious to Providence. A day later, the Parisian parliamentarian Omer Joly de Fleury denounced the book's allegories contrary to religion and morality. Banned in Geneva, condemned in Paris, it was placed on the Roman Catholic Index in 1762 and remained there until 1966. And, lest we forget, Candide was also prescribed by US Customs from the 1930s until the 1950s. As late as 1944, the US Post Office demanded that it be dropped from the catalog of Concord books. Candide was a dangerous text, and Voltaire understandably was concerned about its publication and his own safety. Printed under the pseudonym of Dr. Ralph, he never openly admitted to having written it. He preserved no manuscript copy of Candide, nor any preparatory notes in his library. Likewise, his correspondence reveals no direct clues as to when it was started, how it was composed, or its underlining meaning. When in the late spring of 1759, Voltaire began hinting that he just might have written the book, he affected to dismiss it as an impish jeu d'esprit. Contemporary critics, such as Grimm and Fréron, took him at his word. The former declared that Candide was unworthy of serious criticism. The latter, in a tongue-in-cheek review, recorded that a writer of Voltaire's stature could not possibly have written such an outlandish tale. Germane to the question of Candide's inspiration are the myths surrounding its composition and publication. In line with the author's flippant attitude, it was long asserted that Candide was conceived ex nihilo and written at great speed during a brief visit of about 2 weeks to Schwetzingen Palace near Mannheim. Today, the idea that Candide was written with superhuman facility at breakneck speed is dismissed as highly unlikely. But the notion that it was spun entirely out of Voltaire's imagination and that he conceived it and wrote it quickly without notes has nevertheless impacted generations of critics, many of whom are read today. In his 1967 essay sur Candide, Jean Sarret proclaimed that Candide is a masterpiece without a past. One day it emerged from Voltaire's pen, just like Minerva, who was born fully grown from Jupiter's head. Sarret was convinced that Candide was written quickly without significant revisions. His intuition was endorsed by the critic René Pommier as recently as 1989. But Pommier ought to have known better. The discovery of the Langille manuscript by the American scholar Ira O. Wade in 1956 dealt a serious blow to the notion that Candide was an expression of the author's Dionysian spontaneity. The Langille manuscript was a major find, and its impact was immediately felt. Voltaire's handwritten corrections and revisions gave lie to the notion that Candide was an improvisation. Unlike his outline of L'Ingénu, also discovered by Wade incidentally, no other manuscript copy of Candide or other preparatory material has ever been identified. Even now, almost 60 years after it was discovered, the Langille manuscript continues to influence what we know about Candide's composition. Consider, for instance, that the manuscript gives two versions of chapter 22, the Parisian chapter, and that one of these, an unpublished 60-line fragment, contains unmistakable verbal clues linking it to the Coventry episode in Laplace's 1750 version of Fielding's Tom Jones. Of course, much of the confusion that has arisen around the genesis of Candide is attributable to Voltaire himself. Voltaire concealed the work behind a smokescreen, at first denying that he wrote it, and then referring to it as a trifle, a schoolboy prank. In the absence of an explanation from the author's own pen, we can see why scholars have speculated endlessly about the novel's inspiration and its composition. We might ask at this point, what fresh insight scholarship can provide into Voltaire's art? The answer, not surprisingly, perhaps, is a great deal. Consider this. Scholarly analysis has only recently revealed the extent of Candide's homosexual satire. None of the 19th century's great Voltairistes, Beuchot, Molin, Desnoirter, Faguet, Lanson, Brunetière, or Maurice, seemed even remotely aware of the homosexual dimension latent in Candide's satire of the King of the Bulgars. These men were the products of a puritanical age, and it was perhaps for this reason that they did not understand Voltaire's cruel and suggestive use of the word Bulgar to imply buggery. But both words have the same etymological root. The amazing thing is that Voltaire actually took pains to point this out in an article entitled Bulgare or Bulgare in his Questions sur l'Encyclopédie. Then there is the satirical and cruel portrait of Frederick the Great in Voltaire's posthumous memoirs. And this book is a very curious book. It's called Voltaire's Memoirs. It was published in the Kell edition after Voltaire's death. It's not really a book of memoirs at all. It's a terrible lampoon of Frederick the Great and his court. And one little anecdote which might amuse you is that he does portray Frederick as a homosexual who beds his own grenadiers. But he said he did like a dancer called La Barberini from Italy, but he only liked her because she had legs like a man. And now, Pamela, the recently published epistolary novel modeled on Richardson, in which Voltaire portrayed himself in the role of the sequestered Pamela and the king as the predatory Mr. B. Viewed together, these three works not only throw fascinating light on two of the 18th century's most compelling personalities, they also allow us to catch a fleeting glimpse of Voltaire at work, transforming the raw materials of experience into the stuff of fiction. The memoir, Pamela and Candide combined to satisfy Voltaire's need to take revenge against the Prussian monarch. But whereas the memoirs in Pamela voice outspoken criticisms, in Candide, the only book in the trilogy published during the author's lifetime, Voltaire's indignation found expression in a play on words so discreet and so virtuosic that it remained undetected for well over 200 years. Research into Candide's literary sources has been dismissed by some critics as an exercise in futility. A text like Candide, writes Philip Stewart, is so overdetermined that the quest is never over. The endless sources usually tell us little that is significant. Recently identified sources of Voltaire's inspiration refute this claim and provide a fresh insight into Voltaire's workshop, helping us to refine our reading of the tale and providing a greater, deeper appreciation of his art. Voltaire was a secretive man who rarely, if ever, acknowledged his debt to other writers. Notwithstanding this, we know that in his works, like Montaigne's Bee, he borrowed freely from other texts. As an example of this, we might turn to the 1761 additions to Candide, chapter 22, where the critic Fréron is stigmatized as a man who despises anyone who enjoys popularity, just as the eunuch despises anyone who makes love. The image is at once eye-catching and memorable. One wonders if it was original to Voltaire. Remarkably, its first occurrence in his writing can be found almost 30 years before Candide was written. In a 1732 letter to the Duke of Richmond, he wrote in his characteristic mock, self-deprecating manner, "You have bestowed on me a favor of which I am altogether unworthy. You send the natural history of the tree of life to a poor, sickly, dying man who makes in that noble garden the figure of an eunuch repining in the seraglio at the sight of joys he cannot taste of." 3 years later, Voltaire recycled the same image, this time applying it sarcastically to the historian, scholar, and translator Jacques Haridon. Foreshadowing his 1761 attack on Fréron, a letter to Thériault, dated the 25th of November 1735, states, once again in English, that Haridon envies poets as eunuchs envy lovers. Since the rest of that letter is written in French, it seems not unreasonable to conjecture that Voltaire was paraphrasing an English source. That source, unidentified until now, can be found in the 40th stanza of Dryden's Annus Mirabilis, 1661, in which the kingdom of France is personified as that eunuch guardian of rich Holland's trade, who envies us what he wants power to enjoy, whose noiseful valor does no foe invade, and weak assistance will his friends destroy. One swallow does not a summer make. A second striking example of Voltaire's borrowing from a famous English author, unrecorded until now, can be found in Candide chapter 5, where we come across the following outburst on the part of the wicked sailor in the aftermath of the Lisbon earthquake. "Tête et sang," répondit l'autre. "Je suis matelot et né à Batavia. J'ai marché 4 fois sur le crucifix dans 4 voyages au Japon. Tu as bien trouvé ton homme avec ta raison universelle." Our first comment on this tirade concerns the ritual trampling of the crucifix in 17th century Japan. In his 1966 translation of Candide, Robert Adams notes, the Japanese, originally receptive to foreign visitors, grew fearful that priests and proselytizers were merely advanced agents of empires, and expelled both the Portuguese and the Spanish in the early 17th century. Only the Dutch were allowed to retain a small foothold under humiliating conditions, of which the notion of stamping the crucifix is symbolic. Maurice wrote that Voltaire copied the anecdote from Charlevoix's Histoire de l'établissement du christianisme au Japon, which does not use the word crucifix at all, but rather une plaque de cuivre sur laquelle est gravée une image de notre Seigneur. The same engraved brass plaque is mentioned in Fontenay's Lettres édifiantes et curieuses, which is the source Pommeau references, adding that Voltaire previously used the story in chapter 196 of his Essai sur les mœurs, where the sailor tramples across. Now, I ask you, a brass plaque is not a crucifix, and nor, strictly speaking, is a cross. The image of Dutch merchants trampling an actual crucifix, as referred to in Candide, can plausibly be traced to Swift's Gulliver's Travels, Part 3, Chapter 9. The crucifix is universally regarded as a symbol of Roman Catholicism. Swift knew the difference between a cross and a crucifix, and so did Voltaire. Far from constituting a slur against the Japanese, Swift's satire takes aim at the Dutch and their fanatical Protestantism, as later satirized by Voltaire in Candide chapters 3 and 4. Swift's word choice, which Voltaire copied precisely, implies with devastating irony that Dutch merchants would have no misgivings about walking on a crucifix, their greed and fanatical hatred of Roman Catholicism overriding any scruples they might have of dishonoring the very symbol of Christianity. Viewed within its proper context, the image seems ready-made for Voltaire, and that is naturally why he adapted it to his own purpose in Candide. How scholars can have overlooked this unconcealed intertextual echo, I cannot say. It has often been said that Voltaire went to England a poet and returned a philosopher. Many argue nowadays that his gift for prose satire was inspired by his admiration for the works of Addison, Steele, and Swift. The influence of English fiction on 18th century French literature is a fascinating sub-theme of Enlightenment studies. The novels of Defoe, Swift, Richardson, and Fielding were all published in French before 1760. Until recently, few scholars have troubled to study the contemporary French adaptations of these novels in detail. Falling between national literary traditions, period translations are now considered important texts in their own right. This is because they are true intertexts, different in style, tone, and detail from their originals. Pioneering research in this vein, led by Shelley Charles, has brought to the fore a series of exciting discoveries demonstrating the impact these now forgotten translations had on the works not only of Voltaire, but of Diderot, Rousseau, Prévost, and Laclos. Let me conclude by saying that we will continue to read Candide as long as the world is an imperfect place and as long as satire and irony are the necessary expressions of moral outrage or rage. I would like to end, however, by quoting one of my favorite passages from the book, a passage that never ceases to give me pause and an inward smile. And this is from chapter 30. And the person speaking is the vieille, who's an obvious substitute for Voltaire himself. And after everybody has speculated on metaphysics, she gets fed up. And this is the passage. Ces spectacles faisaient redoubler les dissertations. Et quand on ne disputait pas, l'ennui était si excessif que la vieille osa un jour leur dire « Je voudrais savoir lequel est le pire, ou d'être violé sans foi par des pirates nègres, d'avoir une fesse coupée, de passer par les baguettes chez les Bulgares, d'être fouetté et pendu dans un auto da fé, disséqué, de ramer en galère, d'éprouver enfin toutes les misères par lesquelles nous avons tous passé, ou bien de rester ici à ne rien faire. C'est une grande question, dit Candide. Thank you.
I would, indeed, Voltaire is very important, especially in this day and age when there's a lot of ethnic and religious strife. But the government is trying to silence all the critics of religion and censoring those who would criticize religion. What would you say about that?
Does anyone have any feelings, thoughts, comments too? Perhaps it's outside the kin of our panelists to comment on contemporary religious comments. So maybe if we'll go to a question. You had a question as well, sir.
Should I just speak?
Yes, please. Just maybe right now. Just something. Yes.
Question pour Hans-Jürgen. C'est le couple Mirabeau-Voltaire.
Oui.
Puisque le processus de panthéonisation fait partie du sacre de l'écrivain. Et Mirabeau, comme écrivain, était très mal vu à cette époque-là. C'était l'homme d'État panthéonisé. Alors, est-ce qu'il y avait des échos qui concernaient la carrière littéraire de Mirabeau face à celle de Voltaire?
Non, il n'y avait pas de mise en parallèle entre les carrières littéraires. Mirabeau a été panthéonisé comme comme c'est connu au Panthéon, il n'y avait pas uniquement des écrivains, mais aussi des savants, des hommes politiques, etc. Donc dès le début, Mirabeau a été panthéonisé comme homme politique d'abord et comme grand orateur ensuite, qui a publié aussi ses pièces oratoires, mais pas comme écrivain. La mise en parallèle entre les deux, bon là ce que j'ai montré, c'est une gravure populaire de l'époque même, qui mettait les deux ensemble, parce que c'était quand même les deux premiers panthéonisés. Les mises en parallèle par la suite étaient plutôt négatives pour Mirabeau, parce que, comme on sait, on a découvert assez rapidement, pendant la deuxième moitié de l'année 1791, ces lettres avec le roi Louis XVI qui ont montré qu'il était compromis, qu'il savait qu'il était compromis avec la famille royale, qu'il s'était compromis par rapport à cela, qu'il était plus ou moins aussi même impliqué dans la préparation dans la fuite à Varennes, etc. Donc c'était plutôt une image de Voltaire positive et une image par la suite, à partir de septembre en particulier, septembre, octobre, novembre, qui devient de plus en plus négatif de Mirabeau, qui a d'ailleurs, dont les restes ont été retirés d'ailleurs du Panthéon, comme ceux plus tard de Marat et d'autres, qui ont été dépanthéonisés. Mais sinon, je ne vois pas de mise en parallèle entre les figures d'écrivains. Non, Mirabeau ne passait pas pour un écrivain, pas du tout, comme un orateur.
Oh, thank you. And we'll have one class for here. Yes.
In looking through the work-in-progress editions and subsequent editions, have scholars discovered any significant or any points of change or evolution in what was interpreted as Voltaire's thinking or his philosophy or his view of the world?
I guess that there's just one way I could answer that is with a quote from one of the best, I guess, scholars on the Dictionnaire philosophique. They call it just the question where the dernier bilan de sa pensée. So, in fact, he reflected, and this was sort of harnessing finally his last point of view on these issues. The point in trying to retrace the text is to understand which edition we are reading today and which versions of the text have climbed down through our heritage in the English language world, and simply to understand, what version that might be. With regards to Voltaire's general thought process, that's a whole different question to consider.
I think at this point we should give our panel a chance to set up. So I'll thank the three of our speakers.